I want to thank the sponsors for this lecture series. PNC Bank is our lead sponsor for the series, has been for a few years now, and these kinds of things wouldn't be possible without great sponsors. The Palm Beach Post is also one of the sponsors of the lecture series. I want to thank the staff who helped set this up and who scrambled around to bring in many dozens of chairs extra, and who set up all the AV and audio for these things. And now it's time, I think, to introduce John Loring. John has been a great friend of the museum for many years. He's a very accomplished person. He's an artist. He actually got into Yale, I think, early in advanced mathematics. Is that right, John? And then switched his major. Ended up being one of 2 Americans to be accepted to the École des Beaux-Arts in 1961. I think that's the right year, if I'm remembering correctly. He's nodding, so I'm remembering correctly. That's an anonymous competition, by the way, to get into the École. And it's impressive when any American is allowed in, but it's purely a merit-based system. He was design director for Tiffany and Company for more than 30 years. He was the New York bureau chief for Architectural Digest and has written for them for many decades. The list goes on and on and on. John has a long-time interest in Joseph Urban and his design work, and he's going to tell you all about that. He suggested about a year and a half or 2 years ago that he was working on a biography of Joseph Urban and suggested it would be a great exhibit for us. I thought the timing was perfect because of the town centennial and the fact that Joseph Urban designed 3 of the iconic buildings here in Palm Beach, the Bath and Tennis Club, Mar-a-Lago, and the Sunrise Building, sometimes called the Paramount Theater. So it was a nice coincidence of timing, and good luck to have John's biography come out during this season and for the museum to be able to organize an exhibition on Joseph Urban. If you have not seen the exhibition, it's located in the Changing Exhibits Gallery on the 2nd floor. I hope you'll take the time today or sometime before April 17th when the exhibition comes down to go see the work of Joseph Urban, truly an extraordinary individual. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming John Loring to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. Joseph Urban's triumphant re-entry to Palm Beach after basically about an 80-year absence, and the spectacular show that John has put together here at the Flagler Museum has its origins at the Athens airport in 1977 when I arrived to try to escape the summer at our country house in Greece, only to find Atlantic Airways flight overbooked and begged to be put on any plane going to a European capital. 45 minutes later, I was on my way to Vienna, arrived in Vienna, flung myself onto a bed in the Sacre Hotel and said, what am I going to do now? Gave it a quick thought, went to the Grandiose, to the best bookshop, walked in and said, is there an area of Viennese design I know nothing about? They offered, there were probably many areas of Viennese design I know nothing about, but suggested the Succession and the Wiener Werkstätte. I bought a number of books, took them back to the Sacre, and with my schoolboy German, threw myself on the bed and began to try to read this, and saw that there was this astonishing body of 20th century design that we in America really knew nothing about. So I asked the concierge, are there dealers here in Vienna that sell things like this? And they said, yes, actually there is. They're quite nearby is the gallery by the Albertina. I went there. I purchased a number of things by Joseph Hoffman and other designers. I telephoned Paige Rents, then and still to my mind the Empress of Design of America, who I worked for, and said, Paige, I have discovered an astonishing area of design that I hope you will publish, that I think everyone needs to know about. And she said, well, go ahead and write the essay. I'm not sure I'm going to publish it, but go ahead and do it anyway. Went back to New York, started studying, and discovered that nothing had been written in English about this movement since 1922. We are now in 1977, 55 years later, Amongst the other things, I discovered that in 1922, this amazing architect and designer, Joseph Urban, had opened a Wienerwerkstätte showroom on Fifth Avenue in New York. It received certain reviews, many of them positive. Amazing they were not more impressive, because this was the first appearance of iconic painters of the 20th century, such as Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, and designers Michael Bologna, so on and so forth. So I went to see the only people who had known Joseph Urban, well, the person who had known Joseph Urban, Wallace Harrison, the great architect, and he explained, well, you have to understand, John, that in 1922, 4 years after the war, we, Raymond Hood, myself, we are not allowed to indicate that any influences, whether it was building Rockefeller Center, designing modernism in America, none of it could be said to be Austrian or German after the war. It all had to be, as he said, Frenchy. Well, obviously, Rockefeller Center is not Frenchy, if none of you have noticed that before. So I thought, this is wonderful. I wrote the article for Page and Architecture Digest. He published it in 1978, first thing published on these designers since 1922. And of course, because Page is Page, the interior design world started to include things from the Wiener Werkstätte and Vienna design in their interiors for fear that she might not publish them. And suddenly, the entire design world had had this type of design in their family for centuries. Now, enough of the preface. Let's look at this amazing man himself. So here he is, a 19-year-old in Vienna. He was kind of cute. He had a song about himself where he called him the most beautiful man in Vienna. He was not exactly modest. In any case, he was so brilliant and considered so brilliant by Franz Joseph's official architectural regime that the King of Egypt, Abdus II, requested an architect to come to Cairo and rebuild parts of the Abdin Palace in Cairo. And at 19 years old, as you see him here, Joseph Urban went to Egypt to design part of the royal palace, or a large part of the royal palace in Egypt. Not bad for a teenager. Now, what he saw in Egypt influenced the rest of his career. He was overwhelmed by the incredible brilliance of the blue Egyptian sky. He was also susceptible to fall in love with Orientalism. This is not something he did in Egypt. This was for the Orpheum Circuit, a play in Broadway in 1925, but I think it shows perfectly what he saw and what he kept with him from the experience of designer to Abdus II in Cairo. Now, we don't know what the interiors of the Abdin Palace looked like, but on returning to Vienna, he did a fashion house, and this is just a black and white, we have no colors of it, but I think you can see a kind of neo-Egyptian, an Egyptian revival column on your right, and this probably gives as good an indication as anything as one of the interiors that the 19-year-old did for the King of Egypt. Now, he was recognized immediately for all of his talents. The very next few years brought him to be commissioned by Vienna for a building for the Emperor Franz Joseph's 50th year on the throne. This was his first piece of architecture in Europe. It was called the Emperor's Bridge. And please look at it carefully. It appears first to be neo-medievalism, but please notice the curves of the benches and the things. It was part of the neo-medievalist penchants for Art Nouveau. And the interesting thing is, you'll see this afternoon, is how Joseph Urban transformed himself from a great Art Nouveau architect to a great Art Deco architect, and eventually to our first modernist architect in the United States. He was also a fantastic illustrator and a fantastic draftsman. This is a drawing he did in 1898 for Musaeus's Roland's Knights. Again, look at this amazing architectures that he came up with as an illustration for children's books. This is a small drawing, you know, you look at these things, you imagine they must be enormous. This is probably 10 inches by 10 inches. Imagine sitting down with your Indian pen and doing this without a single splotch, correction, anything. The man could draw. This, sorry, what you do sometimes. There we go. The next year, he was commissioned by the great Hungarian family, the Esterházys, essentially the royal family of Hungary, to build 3 palaces in Hungary. This one in St. Abraham in Hungary, in a kind of, that's going to get very loud, I think. Is that too loud back there? No, okay. Sounds too loud to me, but maybe not to you. Please look, because this is a little bit related, not really to Whitehall, but it is Beaux-Arts architecture with an Art Nouveau twist to it. And here are some of the interiors of this amazing palace for the Esterházys that he built. And please look at the unbelievable detailing of his architecture. It was not just architecture, it was interior design, it was furnishing, and an astonishing sense of drama. And please notice, you notice first in his Kaiser Bridge, there was a proscenium arch to that bridge. And you will notice through all of his work, his love of arches and prosceniums to bring drama to interiors and to exteriors as well. Another view of the entrance hall to the Esterházy castle, quite a wonderful room once again. And the same year, he was so impressed, everyone with the drawings for the Esterházys, that he was commissioned by the city of Vienna to design the Rathaus Keller in the town hall of Vienna, again in an Art Nouveau medievalist style. This room is still very much there today, and some of you have probably gone into it and eaten in it. In 1900, his illustration and draftsman style were recognized in Paris when he won the grand prize for illustration of the Paris World's Fair of 1900. Now, that was no mean feat in 1900 to be recognized as the greatest illustrator in the world. Here is an example of one of the pages from Musaeus's 3 Sisters, a rather Gothic tale, and of course here is some, again, neo-medialist Art Nouveau architecture here, probably some of it rather based on Viollet-le-Duc's work in France. But Vienna was a place where they absorbed every artistic movement, and no style was left unturned in Vienna in those days. He continued as a great illustrator, this time of a children's book, a children's song book with a wonderful title, Cling Clang Gloria. Great title, I think. And many of his designs that he liked were to stay with him through a great deal of his life and be reinterpreted. And as we go through this, I think you'll see that he stuck to the themes, as though, although Art Nouveau turned to Art Deco and Modernism, no, the same themes didn't persist. But here you see many years later, in 1925, here is the stage set for the Ziegfeld Follies, using exactly the same hollyhocks you see on the side of the illustration from Cling Clang Gloria. Back to illustration, in 1911, he did a perfectly wonderful book of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. And one of them he liked the best, as everyone likes the best from Hans Christian Andersen, of course, The Little Mermaid. And here is his illustration for the 1911 Hans Christian Andersen book of his fairy tales. And I want you to take special notice to the fish that are around the borders of this picture, because you are going to see those fish recur and to even later play a role in Palm Beach. As you will, the borders for Hans Christian Andersen, the story of the flying trunk. This is one of the first appearances of the great parrots, of the macaws, in Urban's design and in his architecture, which we have remarkable examples of here in Palm Beach, and which we see in the show upstairs here at the Flagler Museum. This is the illustration for the flying trunk, where you see the young man in his magical trunk flirting with the Persian princess and her pet parrot. Now, Being a theatrical architect by nature and a children's book illustrator, he somehow managed to combine fairy tale princes, palaces, and castles in children's illustration with actual architecture. This is one of those wonderful buildings that he built as a temporary structure. You will notice that the building is based on the imperial crown of Austria. This was the reviewing stand he built for the Emperor Franz Joseph II to celebrate Franz Joseph's 60th year as Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian establishment was not fond of modern art. In fact, the emperor absolutely despised modern art, and at the same time, he adored Joseph Urban and embraced absolutely every project that Urban had. And here is, I think, one of the most eccentric buildings that we can imagine. Again, tremendously theatrical, but the emperor was so pleased, he invited Urban to stand on the reviewing stand for that great parade in 1908 in Vienna. I've thrown this in as many years later, but it's a similar type of architecture that he built as a publicity stunt for the Wheatsworth Biscuit Company in New Jersey called the Gingerbread or Fairy Tale Castle. Please look on the roof ornament of the knight. You will find when you go upstairs to see the Joseph Urban show. John Blades managed to attain it. It was a very witty centerpiece to one of the galleries upstairs. So you will see a bit of this fanciful carnival look of some of Urban's work. Now, clearly, the period he was in, and as I said, he brought the Wiener Werkstätte to America, so of course the checkerboards and designs of the Wiener Werkstätte and their interiors were very much part of his vocabulary. Now, how did Joseph Urban arrive in America? He was in Paris, did you say, discussing the decor for Pelléas and Melisande one afternoon. He designed the original production of Pelléas, and the director of the Boston Opera, Henry Russell, or Henri Roussel, however you want to have it, was there the same day negotiating the arrival of at the Boston Opera of Pelléas and possibly other operas designed by Urban. Urban saw in 1911 that clearly the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was very soon going to get into serious trouble, and maybe it was time to jump ship and do something else. So he accepted on the spot the offer to be, for 5 years, the artistic director of the Boston Opera, and almost immediately left Vienna for Boston, where he pursued that job. And this is one of his sets that he did for Boston. It's a masterpiece of Wiener Werkstätte interiors with all its checkerboards. It's for a very obscure Bizet opera called Jamelet. I believe that's how there's a musician in the house, they can correct my pronunciation. It's not an opera that's very much performed. If you want to find it on the internet, you will find it has a magnificently beautiful trio at the end. It's almost worth going to the internet and listening, but in any case, this is the original and wonderful Wiener Werkstätte set for Jamelet, and you will find both this drawing and Joseph Urban's model of this stage set upstairs, which are two real beauties in the show that you will have here at the Flagler. Now, in Boston, he began to develop what was for many years not only the Boston Opera, but very soon the Metropolitan Opera. And those of us, as I am, who are old enough to have been to the old Met, I think you will recognize in this Joseph Urban set for the Jewels of the Madonna, the signature arches inside portals and all these colored shadows and wonderful plays of light that Urban brought to the American theater. He not only brought those, he banished footlights because before Urban appeared, the theater, and I fortunately, and no one in this room is old enough to remember that, but Urban, when he came to America, American stage sets were pretty much flat painted drops with a bunch of footlights and the actors walking on and off the side, wings of the stage performing and walking off again. Urban brought this very architectural view to stage sets, and this wonderful use of proscenium arches and arches receding into arches to suggest limitless space, for which is very operatic, I think we will all believe. Beautiful example of his love of Orientalism, this for the ballet in Don Carlos, the original production of Don Carlos done at the Metropolitan Opera in 1920. Perfect example of this wonderful color, urban blue, for which he was world famous, and actually in Broadway theater today we still use a color called urban blue. And it's interesting to look at these drawings. If you go upstairs, please look very carefully. The Vienna artists, after a show in the first years of the 1900s by Paul Signac, the Viennese artists discovered pointillism and divisionism. And Urban understood that flat surfaces of paint were not really going to work on stage sets, and that you couldn't change the ambient lighting and change the mood if you painted in flat color. So in this and other drawings, you will see that everything is pointillist. They are all millions of little splatters and points of different colors, and that therefore by changing the color light, you could change the color of the set and certainly the mood. And he was our pioneer and changed the look of our theater here in this country through that. Please note again the use of the receding arches in his sets. Now, I like to, this is also from Don Carlos. This is, oh, I wish I could pronounce the name of that theater correctly. Valladolid, what is the name of that Spanish city? Who speaks good Spanish around here? In any case, it's a set he made from the Cathedral of Valladolid. And look how similar it is to things that he was going to do a few years later. If we think that Joseph Urban did not have a complete command of Med-Rev revival architecture, I think this one drawing, again, lets us rest our case on that. He certainly did. And please notice the blocking out of this set and how similar it is to Mar-a-Lago. So look at that and look at the bridge, and it's almost as though you're driving up to another version of the main entrance of Mar-a-Lago, which he did a few years later after Don Carlos, 5 years later to be precise. Of course, Vienna was also strongly influenced by the symbolists, first by the Belgian symbolists, then by Puvis de Chavannes. And Urban, like the other Viennese artists, fully embraced symbolism, as he did in many of his children's illustration books. This, I think, is one of the most beautiful paintings of symbolism, but is actually the stage curtain for Parsifal. And there you see Tinderell's vision in the spirit inherited forest with the spirit holding the Holy Grail. This is another one of the things upstairs I suggest you look at very carefully. You will never have seen a more beautiful work of symbolism than this. He interpreted symbolism in some monumental ways. This is not a stage set. This is the backdrop for the opening of a gigantic masque in Lewisham Stadium in 1916 to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare. This was about 40 feet high, and when you went to the masque, it was the back of the stage. It's meant to represent Setebos, a symbolist chimera, who was Caliban's father in Shakespearean mythology. In fact, the masque was called Caliban by the Yellow Sands. It included everyone from Isidore Duncan to 15,000 other participants. And as the masque opened in the first scene, this architecture by extraordinary, pulleys and wheels and mechanics suddenly came apart and a whole new stage set appeared. Another masterful use of symbolism in stagecraft here in the United States. And another great example of his architectural use here is for a very different play called Pom Pom the Pickpocket. And this is the scene of the Black Elephant, the rather shady nightclub in Paris where the pickpockets met. But please look at how he uses animals as elements in architecture, something that he continued through his whole career. And again, the receding arches, the side portals, the proscenium, so typical of Urban's wonderful work, to say nothing of his great sense of color. And please notice in all of Urban's sets, there's no such thing as a black or a gray shadow. Every shadow is colored, lending a great luminosity to all of his big sets, and of course allowing colored lighting to vastly transform the mood of a set as an opera or a play progressed. This is Klingsor's Garden from Parsifal, again showing his incredible mastery. This is not a large drawing, but his incredible mastery of detail and remarkable use of color, and again how he can produce a proscenium arch out of simply vines and vegetation. I just think this is so wonderful. Now, we get to the point where we're going to get away from stage sets, and we're going to go a little bit towards architecture. This is the main feature of the Wiener Werkstätte showroom on Fifth Avenue in 1922. Gustav Klimt's The Dancer, you see at the back of the room, was the first Gustav Klimt painting ever to be shown in the United States. Urban couldn't drum up an interest in that, as you have all read in the press in the past few years. A Gustav Klimt painting was sold for the Neue Gallery in New York for over $100 million. The Dancer that you see here was first shown on Fifth Avenue in New York in 1922. It was not possible for Urban's widow to sell this painting for love nor money until 1968. That was 46 years that Americans had no interest in Gustav Klimt, would pay no money for it whatsoever. And actually in 1968, it was not sold in the United States. It was sold by the Galerie Saint-Étienne in New York to Maurice Hirons, the great connoisseur in Paris. And then when he died some years ago, a New Yorker bought it, and it has been returned to New York. But it's very interesting to think of the length of time it took America to accept modernist and this new look at design that Klimt brought to the country. He designed the chairs and the furniture that you see there, and John Blaze has miraculously recreated this room upstairs. So for me, this is extraordinary. I've known this photograph intimately well since I wrote the article for Architectural Digest in 1977. In my wildest dreams, I never thought I would see it in 3 dimensions in color. And you can go upstairs after this lecture, and there you will see the Wiener Werkstätte showroom of 1922 right here in the Flagler Museum, and it is breathtaking, I can guarantee you. The chairs John found in the Detroit Institute of Art. They're tables from the same showroom that come from the Metropolitan Museum. So these things that were completely unsaleable now have finally found appropriate homes. The same year, well, 2 years before, William Randolph Hearst had hired Joseph Urban to be the chief designer of his Cosmopolitan Paramount movies. Those were the films with Marion Davies. Joseph Urban did 20 or more, maybe he did even 30. This was one he did in 1922 called The Young Diana, with a very modernist decor, quite unheard of at that point in 1922, and the chairs in the foreground were borrowed from the Wiener Werkstätte showroom. So he used elements of Viennese design in the Cosmopolitan pictures that he did for William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies. I think it's really quite a wonderful 1922 movie set. Just before, this is the set for Olympia's Ballroom and the Tales of Hoffmann for the Metropolitan Opera, and to show you that he continued to use the vocabulary of Viennese beginning of the 20th century design. Please notice he also continued to use these magnificent parrots, which were about to appear very quickly afterwards here in Palm Beach. And please notice in the spandrels, the monkeys, the lions, the other animals, his love of animal decor. Well, the very next year, he set about his career. He was, strangely enough, people seem to think that he was somehow at odds with Addison Meisner. That is totally untrue. It was Addison Meisner and Paris Singer who invited Joseph Urban in 1925 to come to Palm Beach and to redecorate the interiors of the Everglades Club. This was noticed by Tony Biddle, who immediately asked him to redesign part of his Meisner house here in Palm Beach. Biddle introduced him to Merriweather Post. Biddle commissioned him to build the Bath and Tennis Club, and Joseph Urban was often running in 1925, 26, 27 as undoubtedly Palm Beach's leading architect, Addison Meisner having more or less abandoned Palm Beach for Boca Raton. And I've often suspected that Meisner called upon Urban to come to Palm Beach with the hopes that he could relieve him of his duties here in Palm Beach so he could focus on Boca Raton and Urban could take over Palm Beach. So anyway, here, this, by the way, is a view when you go to Mar-a-Lago. We all get out of our automobiles and scurry straight in the main entrance and pay no attention to the rest of the building. This view is a view if you just take a few steps before you walk in, past the main door and look up, because it's one of the most beautiful views of the building, and there you will see all those sculpted macaws and monkeys and things so dear to the heart of Mr. Urban. Here, quickly, are his original elevations, the four sides of Mar-a-Lago. John was very lucky to find these at the last minute. We thought they didn't exist, and then through a dealer in New York, he said yes, he didn't have the originals, but he did have copies showing Urban's original elevations of Mar-a-Lago as we know it today. Really one of America's most remarkable houses there. The other two sides of it, which you know well. I'm sure all of you were there quite frequently. Here it is under construction. It had not been begun by Joseph Urban. It had been begun by Meredith and Wyatt. Marjorie Merriweather Post, wishing to have a party palace, found that Wyatt's designs were not quite as much fun as she hoped they'd be, and put Urban in charge of the project after she met him through Tony Biddle. Here is simply a detail you'll see upstairs of an elaborate dining room table in Mar-a-Lago, and that is the dining room of Mar-a-Lago as it looked decorated by Urban for Marjorie Merriweather Post, and you will see that piece of the wonderful Florentine inlaid marble table that was there, which is now at Hillwood in Washington. And this is one of the most remarkable interiors in the United States. To me, it is the most remarkable interior here. A masterpiece of Viennese Art Nouveau design. This was Dina Merrill's nursery when she was a little girl. Not surprising, you grow up to be a movie star if you start off this way. But please look to, as you've seen these giant flowers in the stage sets and the vines and flowering vines crawling all over the set of the Metropolitan for Klingsor's Garden and Parsifal. Here again are Urban's love of these flowering trees and arches that join forces in creating all these side portals to a false proscenium of the fireplace at the end of the room. It really is one of America's most beautiful, and it's hard to see here, but this is not painted on the walls. All of those flowering climbing roses are in 3 dimensions. They have a relief of over an inch of carved plaster. You can't possibly see that in a photograph, but when you see them, it is an astonishing amount of work, and all the furniture in the room, as were all those parrots and animals at Mar-a-Lago, carved by a very distinguished Viennese sculptor, Franz Barbey, who had been very important in Vienna before World War I. Afterwards, like all the artists of Vienna, had fallen on hard times, and Urban imported him to execute Urban's designs at Mar-a-Lago, and I think less at the Bath and Tennis Club, but at the Paramount Theater as well. I'm taking you back to the Esterhazy Villa to show the continuation of Urban's themes. This is obviously at the origin of the thought of the arches of flowering vines that you see so many years later, 29 years later at Mar-a-Lago. A perfectly beautiful room, though, in the Viennese Art Nouveau vocabulary. This is the other end of that bedroom. That's quite a bed entirely carved by Franz Barbe. And again, you really would have had the idea you were a princess if that had been your childhood bedroom. This is the way it is today. Donald Trump has kept this very much intact. He's done a very good job of maintaining it. And maybe if someday you're lucky, someone will let you look at it. John has borrowed some of the furniture. You can see some of the furniture from this room upstairs in the Urban show. And here, of course, we started looking at the cause that he was so fond of in his very early career in his illustrations, first of the Flowering Trunk for the Hans Christian Andersen calendar in 1911, and later, as you saw, for the Tales of Hoffmann sets, and on and on and on. And they are the principal sculptures that he has had Barbe carved for Mar-a-Lago, and there is one of those upstairs too in this great show. You will see this reshowing just for fun. This is the now no longer most beautiful man in Vienna, Joseph Urban. He was addicted to good food, good wine, cigars, and wild living, and he put on a few pounds. So there he is talking to his patron, Tony Biddle, who went on to commission him to do astonishing things, not just in Palm Beach, but in New York, the St. Regis Hotel, the Central Park Casino, the North Atlantic Beach Club, and Now, it was Biddle who asked to have the bathroom tennis built, and the first idea of Urban was to go back something towards that 1925 Orientalist design that you saw at the beginning of the talk with its white domes, but this clearly was not going to harmonize with Mar-a-Lago, and that first plan for the B&T was abandoned in favor of the way that wonderful building was built today, and which I'm happy to say has just been magnificently restored by the members of the Bathroom Tennis, where they have actually uncovered some really remarkable newly discovered Joseph Urban details in that terrific building. Of course, the bell tower is missing, and it's mine. I hope many people hope in Palm Beach that one day the bell tower will return to the B&T. There it is. This is one of Joseph Urban's prints, soft ground etching he made of the B&T. But please look at it and think what a good set it would make in the Metropolitan Opera for Cavaliere Rusticana. I mean, the building, too, has its own wonderful operatic and theatrical aspects to it. It's a very, very beautiful, wonderful, wonderful Palm Beach building. He built a number of buildings that are no longer here. Tony Biddle had him build a club called the Oasis Club, which would have been on the ocean, more or less back of where our soon-to-be disaffected post office is. And this was a men's club, built completely, as you see this time, in the Madrid Revival style. It did not survive. It was torn down, I think, about 20, 25 years ago. But a wonderful example of Urban in the Palm Beach vernacular, that style established by Allison Weisman, not by himself. But then, of course, our other great existing building here in Palm Beach is the Paramount Theater, clearly something that was dear to Mr. Urban's heart since he was so involved in building theaters. He was the greatest stage designer and opera set designer at the time. And he built this extraordinary theater that you see here. It has a rather quirky detail to it. The dome on top of it is pure Viennese architecture, and the tip of the hat to the great Viennese architect Otto Wagner and his Hier kommt Steinhof, which is Wagner's great masterpiece outside of Vienna. And for Vienna's sense of humor, I think he found it very entertaining to put an echo of a very famous bit of the architecture of his youth and of Otto Wagner right there on North County Road in Palm Beach. But it really is a remarkable and wonderful building, and we certainly hope that it will be saved. I'm going to show you a few more details of this. There you see the inside of the building and some of its railings. The newel posts on the railings there, those are not the original railings. Those are the things that have to be replaced now. The Joseph Urban's designs are rather more imaginative. But the newel posts that are there are with the fish that are based on the same fish you saw in the borders of the Hans Christian Andersen calendar of the Little Mermaid are exactly the same fish that Barbara has carved there on the newel post. So there you have some original Franz Barbara carvings, somewhat deteriorating at the Paramount. We hope those can be saved. And here I show you the origins of some of those fish. This was the cover of the Hans Christian Andersen calendar of 1911. And of course, those exact fish are going to recur. He loved the Little Mermaid as a subject. His first Broadway show is called The Garden of Paradise, which took place reportedly entirely underwater, which led to some deplorable lines like "forward swim" in the script. But the sets were perfectly beautiful. The play was a tremendous flop, but it was a tremendous success for Joseph Urban because Florence Ziegfeld attended that play, thought they were the greatest stage sets he'd ever seen, and immediately hired Urban to design all of the Ziegfeld ballets, which he did until 1930. So he did that for 16 years. All Ziegfeld ballets productions were designed by Joseph Urban. Ziegfeld loved these sets so much that when the play closed, he bought them all and had Urban reinstall them as decorations in the roof theater of the New Amsterdam Theater in New York on 42nd Street. And there you see are the fish, only vaguely reinterpreted from the cover of the Hans Christian Andersen calendar. And some of you, many of you in the room, I hope, remember going to see movies in the old Paramount and seeing this wonderful stage curtain and the wonderful murals that completely surrounded the auditorium. Those murals are apparently rolled up and stored somewhere in a West Palm Beach warehouse. It would be wonderful if someday the theater were put back together, the murals were pulled out of the warehouse, put back on the walls, and restored. The interior was perfectly magnificent, and we miss it. Now, another fact of Palm Beach that no one seems to have understood before is that Florence Ziegfeld and Joseph Urban opened the Ziegfeld Follies of 1926 right here in Palm Beach with the opening night at a theater called the Club de Montmartre, which would now be on North Lake Way on the campus of the Society of the Four Arts. The building is no longer there, but I show you some of the sets and the stage curtains for Palm Beach Nights, which then went to New York as No Fool in the Ziegfeld Follies in 1926. Amongst its stars were Morton Downey, who was a longtime Palm Beach resident later on, and Paulette Godard, who had gotten into the production claiming to be 18 when she was actually only 16. Here is one of the sets for Palm Beach Nights. I think you can see the influence on Palm Beach and Meisner architecture on Joseph Urban on this. This looks exactly like one imagines a beautiful entrance to a Meisner house must have looked like in the 1920s. And again, another set, the umbrella scene and beach scene from Palm Beach Nights, very reminiscent of the cabanas at the Bath Tennis Club. This is for a later production, but I think again, you can see that Palm Beach and Florida were a tremendous influence on Urban after he had spent his years here. This could very well be for Palm Beach Nights. It's not, but look at this wonderful coloring and wonderful interpretation of tropical greenery, and again how he turns it into proscenium arches, giving you this feeling of limitless space on a very, very small stage. And perfectly beautiful, wonderful coloring. He was a very, very, very great colorist. And here again, for a play that was done 2 years after he began in 1927, when he was completing some of the buildings here. This is for a Broadway play, of course, but it is a théâtre de verdure where you have a central proscenium arch, you have side portals for the actors to enter and exit from, and it is clearly a neatly clipped ficus hedges, such as Urban became intimately acquainted with in Palm Beach. I look at this and expect to go to someone's house one night and walk out into the garden and find this actually there. So if any of you need ideas for your gardeners, I suggest you show them the picture in the book. And before we know it, we could be attending concerts and theatrical productions in your trim ficus garden, and wouldn't it be beautiful to have that here? Now, he had some more grand plans than the Theatre de Verdures in the backyards of our Palm Beach houses. He was commissioned by William Randolph Hearst and Florence Ziegfeld to build a new and very grandiose theater in New York, the Ziegfeld Theater, which was eventually one of the triumphs of New York architecture. I show you this because this is from the 1920 production of Parsifal, the same production where you saw the stage curtain of Tyndall's Vision and of Klingsor's Garden, the spirit in the forest holding the Grail, and apparently pilfered it from this. This is the Hall of the Grail in the Metropolitan's production of Parsifal in 1920. Those of you who are very interested in the history of art, please notice the echo of the mosaics of Ravenna in the dome. It was obviously Gustav Klimt's visit to Ravenna in 1903 that led to the style of Gustav Klimt we know today with the gold backgrounds and the Byzantine-inspired patterns. So he's tipped his hat to that. And now please look at the architectural detailing carved around the columns, and here it is repeated. Oh, no, why did I do that? Well, because I put things out of order, that's why I did that. I'll show you a couple more of these grandiose stage sets. This is for the Vestale, done in 1925. It's a kind of Roman Colosseum or amphitheater. I think one of the most remarkable examples of it is the use of receding arches, side arches, and the implication of infinite space and infinite crowds of people. It may come as no surprise that this was done the same year that Cecil B. DeMille filled the chariot scene in Ben Hur. And here is another example of a stage set with these amazing perspectives and arches and portals from the Vestale, showing that Joseph Urban was just as at home in Neo-Palladianism as he was in Revival style, with Viollet-le-Duc style, Neo-Gothic, Art Nouveau, with Art Deco. The man was comfortable in absolutely every arena. Now, there you see, I should have come before, I guess, there is the facade of the Ziegfeld theaters with those same architectural details that you saw wrapped around the columns in the 1920 production of Parsifal and the Hall of the Grail. This is Urban's own rendering of his Ziegfeld theater. It was built exactly the way you see it there. I'm sure many of you in the audience attended performances there. It was one of our great buildings in New York. And it contained the largest mural in America. That is the ceiling of the Ziegfeld theater, entirely hand-painted in there in the lower right-hand corner. Urban's color drawings and that kept for a piece of that ceiling. You will find a small fragment from the ceiling upstairs in the show here in the Flagler. It's fun to see it, and it only gives a tiny indication of what this absolutely breathtaking mural was when you were in the Ziegfeld theater. Fortunately, when the mural was torn out, it was salvaged by a number of people, and there are bits all over the United States, but I don't think it will ever get put together again, and where would we put it? That, if you've been to the opening night in 1927 of the Ziegfeld, that is what you would have seen, and the giant Spanish shawl filling up the stage curtain. And this is an immense proportion of this whole thing. The Spanish shawl is because the Ziegfeld opened with Rio Rita. On December 27th of 1927, however, the greatest Broadway show of all time opened with the original production designed by Joseph Urban, and so there is the stage curtain, Urban's stage curtain for Showboat. That's what you would have seen on the evening of December 27th, 1927, and this is fun to see. This is upstairs as well. I think you can guess this is the set for the song Old Man River. So that is what you would have seen the first time you had ever heard that song, which you've probably heard more times than you actually need to. He astonishingly enough, not only did these meticulous drawings for the stage sets, he made meticulous models. And this is a three-dimensional model that he did for a stage set where you had Fred and Adele Astaire dancing up and down the Champs-Elysees. And what better image for Joseph Urban with his love of arches to use, but to finally get to use the Arc de Triomphe in a stage set. So there it is. But these sets, you have a number of them models for the stage sets upstairs, and they're perfectly beautiful works of art and wonderful things to see. I think you'll enjoy them so much when you get upstairs. This is quite a big one, so I don't think it's there. Now, unfortunately, in 1929, as you know, we had some very nasty little financial problems in the United States, and these cut short many of Joseph Urban's programs or designs, which would have been wonderful. Otto Kahn was to finance a great theater for the genius of the German theater, Max Reinhardt, and here is Urban's amazing black glass and gilded iron facade for the Max Reinhardt Theater, which of course the Depression kept from ever being built. And interesting enough, he had followed much of Max Hart's direction in the interior of theaters. This was to be the stage where, of course, there's no proscenium at all. And the stage and the side wings of the stage extend into the audience because it was Max Reinhardt's feeling that the performers and the performance should somehow all be more or less one, and there should not be these great traditional divisions between performer and performance. It would have obviously been a magnificent building, but the Depression kept us from seeing that. He also was commissioned by Otto Kahn to build a new Metropolitan Opera, the old one becoming too small. Joseph Urban could think on a very small scale, as you can see in some of these buildings and pilot book illustrations. He could also think on a very monumental and grandiose scale. So here is his suggestion for the stage of the new Metropolitan Opera. Please notice again how there are wings inside portals that extend into the audience, and this absolutely magnificent arch, which is in some ways echoed later on in other American theaters, notably Radio City Music Hall, but we'll get the comments on that in a moment. And here you will see upstairs too that Joseph Urban could not only handle a stage set and domestic architecture, he could handle very, very important buildings. Here is his drawing for a cross-section of the new Metropolitan Opera, which would have been financed by Otto Kahn, but unfortunately, again, the Depression put an end to that plan. That is a drawing of the exterior of it. It would have had a skyscraper attached. And this is, those of you who are very interested in architectural drawing, the great Art Deco renderer was, in the United States was a man named Hugh Ferris, and Joseph Urban amused himself by doing a rendering of the building in the manner not of Joseph Urban, but of Hugh Ferris. And that is what possibly his new map would look like. He also built some what appear to us eccentric buildings today. William Randolph Hearst had him build a new headquarters for Hearst International Magazines on 57th Street and 9th Avenue. That building is still there today, but it has a 50-story kind of oil derrick Norman Foster skyscraper now in the middle of it, built a few years ago. It looks a bit strange, but it was intended to have 12 more stories, so those columns and their urns would have been engaged in the building that went above it. But again, the Depression intervened, and Hearst said, I don't have the money to do this, stop the building where it is, and it served as the headquarters, which it still does, of Hearst Publications, but has now been modified with a 50-story skyscraper in the middle of it. He did many other designs. At the time, he was prolific beyond belief. This is the ballroom of the William Penn Hotel in Philadelphia. Again, his use of the dome with extraordinary murals across the dome of the ballroom of the William Penn, now no longer existent either. This is a lobby for a hotel. We're not quite sure where, but you see using, again, the type of design that he used in the Wiener Werkstätte showroom, and the lamps on the tables are all Michael Volney Wiener Werkstätte lamps. So he continued to, his love of Vienna and his fellow Vienna artists carried over throughout his career to the detail of his buildings. This is a room we have all been in. I don't know, well, just a test. What is this room? You've all been there, you danced there, you've eaten dinner there, you probably went to your deck party there. Well, it's the St. Regis roof, as designed by Joseph Urban for Tony Biddle, again with these wonderful murals of flowering trees and the long-tailed Japanese roosters. And please notice over to the right-hand side, again, the macaws that we find at Mar-a-Lago and so many other places. Unfortunately, none of this decor survives today. This is a drawing that Urban was very fond of, so we used it on the cover of the book. A proposed department store in New York. Again, all of these things took place at a period when the Depression was happening and things didn't work. This building was built. It was the Bedell department store on 34th Street, New York, unfortunately demolished, but one of the most beautiful Art Deco buildings built in New York with very innovative ways of merchandise display, etc. There, of course, look, wonderful department store interior and merchandise displays of Bedell's. And that is a stage set for a play called Flying High with Burt Lahr and Kate Smith. And this does not look like what it looks like today. This is Joseph Urban's version of the Newark airport. But I don't think when you get off your continental flight at Newark, you're going to find it there today. But isn't it wonderful as an example of Art Deco design and stage set? Now, this man turned right around, and in 1929, a commission was held for the New School for Social Research in New York. The two final contestants were Frank Lloyd Wright and Joseph Urban. And Joseph Urban won, hands down, in the competition to design the New School for Social Research. And by doing that, he gave America its first modernist building. So you see, we have gone from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Egypt and royal palaces, and we've gone in not that much time to this man bringing us our first modernist building in this country, which is still there today. Looking, the windows are slightly different than in this drawing, but if you go to 12th Street in New York, you will see what is still one of our most beautiful buildings in New York is Joseph Urban's New School for Social Research, this is what it looks like to this day if you go down 12th Street. Actually, it looks better. There's some trees there now, which there were not when that picture was taken. This is the entrance to that school. Wonderful modernist interior and modernist design. Remember, in 1930, we simply did not have buildings in this country like that. But in fact, the Metropolitan Museum had only held its modernist show in 1929, which was more or less the first introduction of anything modern in this country. But Urban had already designed the New School for Social Research. He did have a room at the Metropolitan, a modernist show in 1929, and the next year the New School for Social Research opened and America had modernism. This is the most important room in it. It's the auditorium in the New School for Social Research. When you look at it, you may say, well, there's certain resemblance to Radio City Music Hall. Clearly, Wallace Harrison and Edward Durrell Stone, when they built Radio City Music Hall a few years later, had paid a great deal of attention to this auditorium at the New School for Social Research. And in fact, Mr. Stern, in his book on 1930s architecture, goes so far as to say Radio City Music Hall is actually Joseph Urban's greatest production. Again, some tremendously modernist things. People seem to think that he was out of step with the other modernist architectures, but he was not. He was perfectly good friends with Raymond Hood and Wallace Harrison. And this is a drawing, you see it's marked houses with Hood and Harrison. This was a project that they were working on probably for the Munich show of 1932. It did not take place. There were some rather unpleasant people taking things over in Munich in 1932. And this was never realized, but they're perfectly wonderful modern houses for medium-income families, somewhat in the mode of Bright Bell, but again showing Urban's love of color, because he was the first architect to introduce an extensive use of color to architecture that had never been used before. I'm not going to show you the layout of this town, but it's fascinating. All of these houses were placed at 45-degree angles of the streets, so that no window of any house looked into a window of another house. Now, why didn't any developer ever think of that before? It's perfectly obvious, but it's never happened, so maybe someone will. Who knows? And then, of course, his final commission was to save the Chicago World's Fair of 1933 from being a rather bland and very boring environment for people at the height of the Depression. Chicago and its bankers could not possibly afford to build spectacular buildings. So Joseph Urban was called upon to give them a sense of spectacle and theater, and he did exactly what you can guess that he did. He introduced the largest use of color to architecture that had ever been seen in history, and painted the entire Chicago World's Fair with these extraordinary colors and added colored neon lighting to the whole thing. There's a letter from Raymond Hood to Urban saying that his coloring lighting saved the Chicago World's Fair. There is his avenue of flags that ran between the Shed Aquarium and the Hall of Science in Chicago. Quite a dramatic alley for a World's Fair, again done with nothing but fabric and color, but creating an architecture out of nothing. And here is the lake view of the Chicago World's Fair as colored and lit by Joseph Urban in a rather satirical and funny comment. The great satirist Alexander Walcott called it God's loveliest backdrop. So I think I'm going to leave you there with this man who created many of God's loveliest backdrops for us. And I thank you for listening to this, and I beg you to go upstairs and look at all these wonderful things in the spectacular. Does anyone have questions that I may or may not be able to answer? Yes, ma'am.
I was privileged to visit with Joseph Urban's daughter, Gretel, for the last 2 or 3 years of her life. She lived to be almost 100. And yet what puzzles me, because in the many visits I had with Gretel, and this is the book that she had
She did, yes.
Yes, she considered it like the great accomplishment of her life. And yet from all the conversations I had with Gretel, and from the way her father's last letter reads, it puzzles me that she doesn't appear more in the book. Well, of course, maybe she made sure of that herself. But I got the impression, or more than the impression, that Gretel worked very closely with her father on all of this.
Yeah, yes, that is a very good point to bring out, and you were absolutely right. Gretel was a painter, and she worked on many, well, maybe all of his mural projects. She did not work on drawings for the stage productions of the architecture, with the only exception of the vast number of sketches that were done for Showboat. But it is extraordinarily obvious when you study the sketches that Gretel, although she was a terrific artist and obviously had enormous talent, that it did not approach her father's talent at all. But she did, in fact, in the case of the Paramount Theater murals, she is credited with painting a great deal of those. But in the studios, those were all painted in the studios in Yonkers, New York, and shipped down here, as all the murals were painted in Yonkers. And there were actually dozens of assistants who painted those. And it's really impossible to decipher which sections were painted by which assistants. Clearly, Joseph Urban himself did not paint the zinc ceiling. It's totally impossible. I mean, time would never allow. And nor could Gretel have painted herself all the murals for the Paramount Theater. We consider this very strongly, and that is a wonderful book. It is, in a way, more a book about their family life and the personal life of the Urban family, which is extremely charming and extremely revealing. But we felt in doing the book that we really wanted to focus on Joseph Urban himself and his work, and that book had amply covered Gretel Urban. So therefore we moved along and did that somewhat differently, but we don't wish to take any credit away from Gretel or any of the other artists who worked on these projects. Yes.
There's a picture upstairs of the Rathskeller at the Vienna.
Yes.
And there's a similar Rathskeller in Prague.
Yes.
Joseph Urban did that one also.
No, he did not do the Rathskeller in Prague. No, no. Oh, sorry. There's a similar Rathskeller in the town hall of Prague in Czechoslovakia, but no, Joseph Urban did not do that. But it was at that point in history rather common for the Rathskellers to be done in this kind of neo-medievalist Art Nouveau style. And I've been to Prague, but I'm sorry to say I never went to the Rathskeller, so I can't comment, but no, he did not do that. No. Yes?
A bit of trivia. In the movie Ziegfeld, William Powell says to a passerby, "Great sex, Joe."
Well, that would have been great sex, Joe, to Joseph Urban. And there are other amusing comments in history. Will Rogers made the comment at one point, "That fellow Urban sure wields a mean brush." But you're right, that comment is a tip of the hat to Joseph Urban.
Yeah.
Yes.
Back here, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious. I live in New York, and I've been in and out of the Hearst building for years, and it had no romance to it or polychromatic sense to it. It was sort of a strange pink, beautiful ornament, then it went drab brown. So as a result, I don't think Urban is considered the architect that he really was. And was there not somebody, public or Hearst family, who didn't see that the building was completed with the same kind of intent that Urban must have had? They put that horrendous, modern glass tower, and the two have nothing in common. So they ruined what could have been, I think, a beautiful tribute to Joseph Urban.
Well, yes, you've all heard that. I think that the Hearst building has been gutted inside. It had been considerably altered before it was gutted inside. The exterior was not altered, but the interior, I think, went through a number of renovations to modernize elevators, modernize lighting, modernize this and the other thing. And finally, it was insufficient for the offices of the Hearst International magazines, and the Hearst family decided to simply preserve the exterior of the building, which I believe is a New York landmark, but the interior was not, and put the Norman Foster Tower there. I would prefer not to make comments of my estimation of Sir Norman Foster's architecture, so I'm going to leave that part to all of you to decide, make your own decisions, what you think of the Hearst Tower in New York.
The fireplace nook that you illustrated in Esterhazy Palace bears a remarkable resemblance to a fireplace nook in Casa Batlló by Gaudí, and they both architects share this neo-medievalist theatricality. I wonder if there's any link between the two.
They don't. We have no record of Urban ever visiting Barcelona or seeing that. But yes, the organic nature of that part of Art Nouveau architecture, yes, certainly circulated around Europe. At that point, we did not have the same publications, and we did not have the internet, and we did not have television, all those things. So there were shows, architectural shows, Victorian show, the various shows, where everybody brought their things from their own countries, and the cross-pollination was tremendous. I mean, there was also a tremendous influence in Vienna by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which is where the checkerboard effects came from. There were, as I said, major influences that came from the French symbolists of Auguste de Chavannes, as well as the Belgian symbolists like Troop. There were also influences that came from Paul Signac, and so on and so forth. So the Viennese, it was a place of incredible intellectual ferment and curiosity. And as I say, there were great design magazines published in those days that obviously were mostly in black and white. But I don't think any of the Viennese architects or any architects in Europe ignored the work of the other European architects. So whether Urban had, looked at Gaudi's work, I don't see that the extraordinary and, radical organic approach to architecture of Gaudi's was really part of Urban. I have the greatest respect for that Gaudi. He's a perfectly wonderful architect. But I somehow don't, I know that Urban did not know Barcelona. I never saw his buildings. He never saw an illustration of it.
John, we have a question from an internet
yes.
audience member about Joseph Urban's family life. Can you comment on that?
Yes, Joseph Urban's family life. He had a collaborator, Leffler, and he married Mitzi Leffler. He became the brother-in-law of his collaborator, and the two of them they worked so closely on many projects, some of the illustrations for books, that they were actually known as the twins in Vienna. And the family ties were extremely close. But when Urban decided to leave Vienna in 1911 and go to America, that was really the end of the family ties because Leffler did not survive World War I. So when he and his wife Mitzi went to America, that was really the end of the family ties in Vienna. He was not particularly close to his parents, who had very much disapproved of his becoming an artist. They didn't think this was a good career to follow. That happens to all of us involved in the arts. Our parents may not be overly approving of that. And some of us go down in flames at it, and some of us don't. But his Mitzi, I don't think that they had two daughters, Gretel and another daughter. Their marriage did not survive forever, and it was around 1920 that he divorced her and married his second wife, who he stayed with for the rest of his life, and apparently had a very happy life. I don't think he ever had an unhappy life with anyone. He just saw someone younger and cuter, I guess.
Did he travel in Morocco and Egypt?
Excuse me?
Did he travel in Morocco and Egypt?
No, I don't believe he traveled in Morocco. He traveled in Egypt. He was very fond of Egypt, and he returned to Egypt later in life. But I don't believe he did that. He traveled extensively in Europe. He was very fond of Venice. He traveled in Mexico. He did a certain amount of travel, and he certainly was very influenced by his travel to Florida, as we all are. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I want to make sure we have time for John to sign books and answer questions personally at the back of the room. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our sponsors, PNC and the Palm Beach Post. We had twice the number of tickets sold in the last 20 minutes today. So just let me make a comment here. You can buy tickets online ahead of time or call the office for tickets. I hope you'll join us for our next lecture, which will be on Schultz and Weaver, who designed that gigantic Medici palace across the way called the Breakers. I hope you'll come. That'll be next Sunday at the same time. And I want to thank our online audience for joining us today. We had 10% of our audience today joined us in our virtual lecture hall to see the same images and hear the audio. So thank you all for being here.